This video is a continuation on from the last one in Astrological Thinking, and it's Astrological Thinking 2. The critics, or the people that pour such scorn and contempt upon astrology, I think are mistaken in their attempt to wipe it off the system as a wipe it off the map as a genuine knowledge system or practice, because there's a great fear behind it that in some way, because astrology developed out of a kind of sympathetic relationship with the things about them, rather in the manner of what is called a participation mystique, a kind of animism or an anthropomorphism, which saw things in things, saw metaphor, but didn't take it as metaphor, take it as literal. Rather like that there are spirits in trees and plants, and there are spirits around the planets that make them move. It's a kind of very imaginal existence, because we didn't know any better. We didn't know about the forces of gravity or mechanics or anything of that until Copernicus, really, and Kepler, Galileo. And it was around about that time that astrology started to branch into two avenues: the science of cosmology, and then there were the kind of beliefs in a cosmology. But before all of that, the ideas of the ancient Renaissance, and before that the heavens were filled with celestial hierarchies of angels and archangels and cherubims and cherubims, just to name a few of the Christian ones. I'm sure they had other deities up there. There was the don't know my Plato much, but or my Aristotle, there's the nous, and various subtle realms of hierarchies and so on. All of celestial beings leading up to the omnipotent God, who was in ancient times in Egypt actually just space itself, the container of all things, and the mother and father of all things was space. Because space was everywhere, ever present, omnipresent, and it was within that space that order started to appear. You see, and so the heavens at that time, going right back to the Chaldean era, were a way of ordering one's life through the seasons, through the cycles of the sun and the cycles of the moon, certain stars rising, and all of that kind of thing. That there was started to be a pattern of development of man's activities and thoughts and processes, all based upon the calendar and the seasons, cold, light, heat, particularly in Egypt, of course, the flowing of the Nile, which was thought of as a divine event because it used to bring life and community, and a lot of commerce along the river, a lot of life born from it. And as soon as the scarab beetle was seen, it was thought that it was the renewer of life, which is a symbol of Cancer in many ways, sometimes perhaps Scorpio, but Cancer more like, because it carries its own home on its back, and inside that home is a kind of nest from which new life is born, which is why the scarab beetle is a symbol of rebirth, or the renewal of life from water. Similar to certain Indian nations in America, to do, I think, with the crayfish, bringing life after the deluge. Anyway, I'm getting lost in a morass of symbolism, but the idea, you see, behind astrology was very linked in to the imaginal and bringing life to the imaginal. It's metaphysical rather than actual, rather than scientific facts. But before that time, these were deemed to be facts and acted upon, and this has been derided ever since the ongoingness, if you like, of the Enlightenment, and then into the 19th century and into the 20th century, where what was believed in started to fade because they were seen as mythical stories, particularly stories of the Bible, or cosmological theories of the early Renaissance, or alchemy, and particularly astrology. Because astrology used to go with the trend, but at one time, two or 3,000 years ago, perhaps longer than that, to 4,000 BC, perhaps, that astral myths, the the perception of the cosmos and the stars, they were deemed to be planetary gods, and the great god Ra himself. Uh, so the the point of all this is that what was imagined on the stars was thought to be true and believed in, but actually it was a mythic perception, a mythic projection upon our own lack of understanding, if you like, at the intellectual level, upon the stars. And this is what I think the rationalists fear. So you get some words like astrology, and it's as if it's a kind of retro romantic view of life, that you're going back into mythic beliefs such as animism and belief in spirits of streams and things. But and so that's all put aside, because there's a great fear that the great rationality, the movement towards the enlightenment and empirical fact and truth, is going to be in some way overshadowed by an early mythic structure of belief, following this, that, or the other, believing in anything, or rather woolly and all that. And so a belief in that is considered by the rationalists to be a backward step. And so people such as Sam Harris, for example, who is at the forefront, I think, of very, very important debates, a spiritual man, I believe, with a great mind and a great ability, a discursive ability. Has a vast amount to draw upon, but all the time in his arguments, what I see is this fear that the literalism of certain things, with certain impossible things, fairy tales, stories that he calls them, and that you can make up stories about anything. In fact, in one of his discussions, he talks about seeing a recipe for something and then projecting into that recipe all kind of high-minded things, some spiritual truths. But therein lies the actual answer. Therein lies it. What gives it? What is that ability to read into things, other things? That is called symbolism, or the metaphoric, the poetic imagination. And the poetic imagination, you see, is a real thing. It leads on to a trail of thought or imagination and feeling, and it's got highways and byways. When one starts contemplating or meditating on an image or a symbol, particularly astrology, especially if it's astrology, then something magical happens in the imagination. Anything can become symbolic, but it's when we enter that mode of the symbol and allow our mind to trail away freely in it, especially if we've meditated upon it, especially if that symbol is imbued in our system with connections and associations, then in certain situations, when we ponder upon an astrological symbol or anything, something can come from within which orders our mind in a particular way. Orders our rational mind to say something, almost as if we are divining a situation. Now, this is a very archaic idea and relies on the poetic or mythic imagination. Now, in earlier times, there was lots of kind of theories about how this worked. A theory of essences, for example, that things had essences in them, and that if you could get back to the root of that essence or the archetypal pattern, then you could find this system of a great system of correspondences. Swedenborg, in his theology, Christian theology, and so on, about the spiritual worlds, talks a lot about this theory of correspondences and images and symbols linking a lot of things. In many ways, astrology is a series of categorizations. The planets have particular kind of meanings which stretch out into all kind of directions. I've written about this in a small booklet called Symbol to Substance, and it's about how to delineate this series of correspondences in four different dimensions: the mineral kingdom, the animal kingdom, the human being, and the sociological system, and the plant kingdom, and the mineral kingdom. Anyway, yes. So what I'm trying to say is that the fear of the critics is that a study of some archaic system like this will also take us back into into a belief system which has been far superseded by rational science. And this is a misnomer. This is the problem. Astrology evolves, and it has evolved in virtually every culture right from when known. And it moves in and out of different centuries and different phases of its use, and yet it wanders back in time and time again, never leaving the mind of a man, as if astrology has the study of the stars or the study of the astral realms, the great mysterious unknown out there. And so the imagination has its own rules too. Who is to say the imagination itself hasn't certain rules of logic, hasn't certain rules of perception or knowledge which can be perceived only through that field of the poetic imagination? Certainly Jung believed this. The mythologist, the great mythologist Joseph Campbell, has spent a lifetime showing this. Now, where Sam Harris needs to be listened to in this regard, who am I to say? I mean, he's a massive intellect, but I'm trying to make the point that, as Ken Wilber made, that mythology alone is kind of superseded by science, but rationality, when it reviews mythology, it can see patterns in it, patterns of development of behavior that were perceived by the imagination. So that what was believed in, if an ancient tribe believed, for example, that if they didn't say their invocations in the morning, the sun wouldn't come up, this can now be symbolized as having to kind of come into or wake up in the morning and make sure that one is awake and not in the realm of the unconscious. You see, and this is a different way of interpreting the ancient ideas of the rising sun and certain rituals and bringing it into being, because we're all surrounded by the ever-present fear of death. The light can go out at any point. So the mythic realm, when looked at in this way, when looked at through archetypes, through patterns, through reinterpretation of various meanings, and which Jordan Peterson has done so much to bring back. In many ways, he continues the Jungian work forward to re-infuse, revitalize these ancient symbols with greater psychological meaning. But we must remember, as Sam Harris talks about, that it is only the intellect which allows us to see it. So we've had to have an intellect to reflect on these for greater meaning. Otherwise, we do fall back into ancient belief systems. And here's the point about astrology. There's no need to believe in anything about astrology to practice it. One can go back into cosmological theories, Renaissance theories of energies or energy fields stemming from the planets. Astrology is linked to occultism too, which came into the medieval period. It's linked to evoking forces beyond the known through gods and goddesses and various ritual invocations and evocations through talismans or rites or the geisha or various things, or talismans and charms, putting astrological symbols on them. Was it fortunate or unfortunate? I don't know, but astrology can be used for anything and brought in, as I say, for use. So there is certainly a magical element to astrology, but that's only a few hundred years old. That's all since been superseded by the latest idea, I think, in astrology of linking it as a form of mirror, that the patterns of the horoscope somehow uh, order our mind along the cosmological, order our mind along a particular course to arrive at certain situations, to arrive at certain conclusions. And so to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to throw the whole mythic perception of the world, the poetic imagination, and the access to different realms of knowledge through the imagination, although it's coordinated through a system, let's say astrology or tarot or Kabbalah or path working mechanisms, path working systems through the Kabbalah, various things such as the runes. These are all systems by which we can access different forms of knowledge in a different way. Now, we can come back out of that without having to believe in anything at all. Certain archaic theories, as I say, of alchemy, so on, can be seen or readdressed in a new way. They can be reinterpreted as Jung interpreted them, as the alchemists trying to find a way, trying to find those processes which are involved in the transformation of a lesser consciousness to a greater consciousness, as symbolized obviously by the prima materia being transformed eventually into gold or to different substances, which is what happens in the human individual with self-reflection and the power of mind to reflect on its own person, on its own emotions and so on. And this mixture of mind and body and perception and imagination and action, of course, all of these kind of things help a transformation of the personality. So there is a great deal in alchemy which can be taken out and applied to human life. Anybody who reads the Anatomy of the Psyche by Jungian analyst, can't remember his name now, but a great book about the processes of alchemy and how they depict psychological developments, the 7 operations of alchemy. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, we must remember that we're rationalists and that all symbols depend on a context of meaning and ought to be interpreted. But astrology can do that. It looks at a symbol and it interprets it within a particular context, whether it's the life characteristics of a person or life force, or can even be interpreted in terms of a psychological dynamic which can be worked on through the symbol. There's no getting away from the fact that when we meet clients, there is a subjective element that is involved in it. There's a kind of fusion into the symbol with the client. Yes, there is a telepathic element, I think, that goes between a kind of counter-transference or transference, counter-transference effect. Perhaps there is some way in which the client affects our interpretations when they are present with us. All these things are unknown, an unknown dimension to astrology. But there is no set formula. This is the thing. You can't say this equals this, as older astrologers tried to do, to try to fix their meanings. And this is why a lot of the texts are very fixed futures, and if Saturn is in the 3rd house, you're going to suffer a kind of mental deterioration or a heavy melancholia. I remember reading in Vivian Robson about Mercury square to Saturn, that you're likely to be let's say mentally condemned, or if Mercury was square Uranus, you are likely to go mad in midlife or have a peculiar kind of mindset and so on. While these interpretations are valid in a symbolic way, they're not to be taken as literal. So in short, what I'm saying is, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That the contemplation of symbols is a very important element in learning to balance up both sides of the brain. One brain produces symbols, myths, experiences, fantasies and imaginations, and the other side of the brain contemplates or thinks about those things in terms of the known. Now, there's a great video between McGilchrist and Jordan Peterson about these two sides. They discuss I think it's called something like one of the most important questions you can ever ask. It's a 30-minute clip on YouTube. It discusses the way one side of the brain perceives life in an orderly, rational, comprehensive fashion and seeks to put things into categories, rationalizes them. But there's another part which is attuned to the unknown, the evolution. And this is the imaginary part, which taps into a very older type of the brain, perhaps perceiving ancient patterns, archetypal responses, and forms symbols. And so somewhere in astrology, the connection between the symbolic and the art of interpreting it into a rational framework of guidance is very important. As not to mention the application of a kind of divinatory attitude towards astrology, which can produce spontaneous interpretations, if you like, rather like the divine seers of old, those diviners which called upon, if you like, the astrological symbols to tell them things. A highly developed form of divination, of course, is orrery astrology, which is another subject in itself. It's interesting that this has never been looked at either when critics criticize astrology, or I just take them back to William Lilly, 1647. Have a look at those, how a practicing astrologer worked in that time, and how brilliant they actually were, provided, of course, you can work through the whole thing. So, as I say, critics of astrology tend to bring that argument forward as if you're falling back into a retrogressive mythic world of irrational sop. And it really isn't that. The academic side of astrology is to know the myths, is to know the astral religions of old, to know all the symbols, and it's their all of the vocabulary and all of the things that have been worked out over hundreds of years to do with astrology and written down. Yes, there were some peculiar things there. Yes, there was ideas about prediction and so on, but astrology has survived all that and come into the 20th century as a valid form of trying to apply a rationality to the imaginal. In many ways, I would call astrology a science of the imagination. A capacity not to get lost into the imagination, but to use it alongside a symbolic system for personal and other forms of guidance. In other words, a genuine process and a genuine knowledge system which can still be used in the present day.